Hey everyone, and welcome to today's study. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining me because we are about to unpack a truly profound philosophical question. What we're doing today is presenting a full summary of a rare and totally fascinating Q&A session by the brilliant mathematician and philosopher Dr. John Lennox. We're going to be looking directly at his arguments regarding the origins of human morality. Really examining where our sense of right and wrong actually comes from, and looking closely at the unavoidable dilemmas that pop up depending on the worldview we choose to hold.
So let's just dive right into the massive question that frames our entire study today. Can morality be properly explained without God? And to be totally clear, Dr. Lennox moves way past trivial definitions here. The source material argues that morality isn't just whatever you happen to want it to be, or some weird biological reflex where we see something bad and our brain just goes, boo! Instead, Lennox is looking for a legitimate grounding for the actual existence of objective good and evil. He's asking why certain things are actually universally right and certain things are actually wrong.
Now, before we go any further, I definitely want to note that this full summary is based on the incredibly hard work from the Daily Dose of Wisdom channel. You can find a link to their original material right down below in the description box. And on behalf of the original authors, I want to sincerely add that prayers for the Watchmen channels are very much appreciated as they continue to share these important, heavy discussions.
Okay, let's jump straight into our first major point. Part 1. The question of morality.
Right off the bat, Dr. Lennox tackles a super common misconception. It's this assumption that religious folks think morality strictly comes from just reading a holy book. He contrasts what we call subjective morality, the idea that right and wrong are just, personal preferences or evolutionary emotional responses, with objective morality. Objective morality argues that certain things are just true. For example, the fact that Mother Teresa is objectively a better human being than Adolf Hitler. The presentation really explores how we rationally explain this legitimate difference. We are looking for an actual explanation for the existence of these objective moral choices, not just an emotional response to evil.
Which brings us to Section 2, the universal moral compass. To really understand this, Lennox has to disentangle fact from fiction regarding atheists and their ability to be moral. Because listen, the question isn't whether people without a belief in God can be good people. Lennox emphatically states that every single human being, whether they believe in God or not, is a moral being made in the image of God. Therefore, he argues, atheists, just like Christians or people of any faith or literally no faith at all, have deep moral concepts. In fact, he points out that you can even read in ancient biblical texts about times when pagans behaved incredibly well, sometimes totally putting religious people to shame. The capacity for goodness is absolutely not restricted to believers.
To back this up, Dr. Lennox brings in some historical research from C.S. Lewis's 1940 book, The Abolition of Man. In the appendix of that book, Lewis basically gathered data from all around the globe. He looked at different tribes, ancient nations, pagan philosophies, and wildly diverse cultures separated by vast oceans and centuries of time. And what he found was just astonishing. Human beings everywhere universally share a built-in moral compass.
The massive takeaway here is that regardless of your tribe, your nation, or your philosophy, Lennox argues there is a common core of morality built right into us at a basic level. Literally everywhere you look in human history, you find a foundational respect for the elderly, a high value placed on telling the truth, and a strict prohibition against murder. Now sure, you'll find cultural variations on the margins, like say, how many wives a person can have. But the core remains solid. Dr. Lennox argues that the Bible merely refines and sharpens this pre-existing compass. It doesn't invent it out of thin air. According to the source, we are just inherently moral creatures.
This brings us to a really fascinating philosophical pivot in Section 3, the dilemma of naturalism.
So if absolutely everyone possesses this internal moral compass, Dr. Lennox asks the million-dollar question: how does a worldview that entirely removes God logically justify that compass even existing? Naturalism is the worldview that completely dismisses a transcendent God. The presentation points out that when you do that, you are forced to find an alternative source for morality entirely within the natural world. You have to locate the basis for right and wrong strictly within raw biology, genetics, or human social dimensions.
Which leads straight to a famous observation by the great Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky. If God does not exist, everything is permissible. Now hold on, we need to be very precise about this. Dostoevsky did not mean that atheists are incapable of good behavior. We have already established they absolutely are. What he meant was that, according to this argument, there is absolutely zero rational justification for objective morality if God does not exist. Lennox posits that if you follow naturalism all the way to its logical conclusion, you completely lose the foundational concept of objective right and wrong.
Because if you turn to nature for your morals, the source material argues you're going to hit a massive contradiction. For instance, Charles Darwin looked at ants cooperating with each other and thought, here is a biological basis for altruism and kindness. But then, Herbert Spencer looked at the exact same natural world and saw nature red in tooth and claw, establishing the brutal concept of the survival of the fittest. Depending entirely on which animal behavior you choose to highlight, you can justify completely contradictory ethical standards. The presentation suggests this leads to absolute moral confusion, simply because nature itself is morally blind.
All right, moving on to Section 4, the judgment of conscience. Let's bring this down to a deeply personal level. Dealing with the inward consequences of possessing this compass, the source material notes that a person's conscience can be seared, bent, or completely broken. People do terrible things all the time, and sometimes they even call bad things good. However, Lennox argues that the very fact that we use words like seared or broken proves that real objective moral distinctions still hold true. He asserts that having an opinion about what is evil doesn't magically turn an evil thing into a good thing. The distinction is real regardless of our arbitrary, shifting opinions.
Which forces a really heavy question upon us. Dr. Lennox points out that this built-in moral compass doesn't just guide humanity, it actively judges us. He notes that humans rarely, perfectly keep even their own moral standards, let alone the standards of a perfectly holy and just God. So the presentation asks, where exactly does that leave us when we inevitably fall short of the very compass operating inside our own chests?
And that leads us to our final point, Section 5, the unique solution of grace.
This is the profound answer to the human condition that every belief system ultimately attempts to solve. When dealing with our moral failures, the presentation notes that general religious systems almost universally demand perfect performance or good works. Essentially, the solution has to come from within you. You have to try harder. But Christianity is highlighted as offering something extraordinarily different. It actually starts with the premise that nobody is morally perfect, and therefore it relies entirely on grace received as a gift. It frames the solution not as an exhausting personal effort, but as a total rescue operation coming from outside the individual.
The source material summarizes how this rescue framework operates. Jesus Christ uniquely exchanges innocence for guilt. Lennox argues that this is a solution that is simply not on the table in any other belief system. It's designed to actually address the depth of human moral failure against an objective standard. Instead of just pointing a finger and demanding humanity do better, it provides a savior who takes the guilt and offers innocence in return.
I want to conclude our study today with this incredibly provocative thought from the presentation, just to leave you pondering. If you recognize that objective morality truly exists, and you realize your internal moral compass points to a standard that you cannot perfectly keep, where will you look for your rescue? It's a massive question, and it's one that demands a rational answer. Thank you so much for joining me for this full summary, and please keep exploring the truth.